what are the functions of theory in research, especially in fields like leadership, administration, and organizational science. Why should we care about theory at all? Why not just let data speak for themselves? The truth is, theory is not an optional add-on to research. It's fundamental to making sense of data and experience. Theory organizes our inquiry, guides our interpretation, and even shapes what data we collect in the first place. Data without theory are like a pile of bricks with no blueprint. They're useful pieces, but they're not buildings. Data, no matter how abundant, do not interpret themselves. It is theory that weaves research findings into a coherent narrative. In short, theory is the intellectual architecture that turns information into knowledge. In this video, we'll explore 4 key functions of theory in leadership research and practices. At its core, a good theory serves as a tool for prediction. Theories enable us to anticipate what will happen under certain conditions. When we embrace a theory, we gain a kind of theoretical hammer with which to hit the nails of prediction in our field. If we truly understand a phenomenon, we should be able to predict outcomes or behaviors that have not yet been observed. For example, the early social psychologist Kurt Lewin argued that understanding the forces in a situation, which is expressed in his famous equation, behavior is a function of a person and environment. This allows us to predict behavior. A theory translates into a hypothesis, the specific if-then statements we can test. In 1869, chemist Dmitri Mendel proposed the periodic table as a theoretical framework for chemical elements. His theory, the periodic law, suggested that elements, when arranged by atomic weight, show repeating patterns of properties. Importantly, the periodic table predicted the existence of new elements even before they were discovered. Mendeleev left gaps for elements that his theory said should be there with specific properties. In the next 2 decades, scientists indeed found elements with properties strikingly close to predictions, which confirmed the power of his theoretical model. Likewise, in physics, the Higgs field theory, proposed in 1964, predicted a new particle, the Higgs boson. For almost 50 years, this particle went unseen, yet the theory stood as a signpost for experimentalists. Finally, in 2012, researchers at CERN's Large Hadron Collider observed a particle matching the predicted properties of the Higgs boson exactly as the theory predicted. Those cases underscore how theory pushes knowledge forward by daring to predict phenomena that are later confirmed. Theory earns its credibility. In social sciences, we see the same principle. Consider role theory in organizational behavior. Role theory posits that an individual's behavior is shaped by their social role expectations. If that theory is sound, we can predict that a person will make different decisions when acting as a school principal versus a teacher, even if confronted with the same situation or the same data. The role theory provides a theoretical lens. A principal may prioritize school-wide policy and long-term outcomes, whereas a teacher may focus on classroom concerns. The theory predicts systematic differences in decision-making based on role. Another example is the approach inhibition theory of power. Psychologists Dieter Keltner and colleagues developed this theory to predict how having power versus lacking power can influence our behavior. The theory argues that elevated power activates the behavioral approach system, which leads people to focus on rewards and act with less inhibition. Lower power activates a cautious, inhibited orientation. From this approach inhibition theory of power, we can predict that power holders will be more likely to exhibit impulsive or self-serving behavior. For example, paying more attention to potential rewards and taking discretion with rules, whereas the powerless will behave more cautiously and vigilant of punishment. Research findings suggest that people who are given a test of power become more impulsive, less empathetic, and more likely to pursue their own goals, just as the theory predicted. The takeaway is that theory, when well developed, allows us to generate hypotheses before we even see the data. This predictive guidance is valuable in research and practice. However, not all theories succeed in this function. A theory must have enough precision to yield meaningful, testable predictions. Otherwise, it's not much a theory at all. A classic cautionary example is contingency theory in leadership and management. Contingency theories basically say it depends, that the best course of action or structure depends on the situation. While intuitively true, early contingency theory was so broad, consider all the factors, that it struggled to produce clear predictions. In fact, it became a little bit of a catch-all for explaining everything after the fact, without predicting beforehand. If a theory can explain any outcome post hoc by evoking some contingency, then it predicts nothing in particular in advance, which is a serious weakness. In response to the criticism, the developments in contingency theory substantially improved its theoretical precision. Researchers defined and measured specific situational variables, such as task structure, leader-member relations, environmental uncertainty, and decision-making centralization. Those variables were then linked systematically to leadership behaviors and organizational practices. The refinements enabled contingency theory to make conditional predictions. For example, directive leadership is more effective when tasks are ambiguous and the followers lack experience. This kind of predictions align with the standards of falsifiability and allowing for empirical testing. What began as an intuition gradually evolved into a more structured framework capable of guiding leadership selection, communication strategies, and decision-making processes in context-sensitive ways. A good theory should risk predictions. It needs boundaries and clarity so we can say, if the theory is correct, then X should happen under conditions Y. This is why Karl Popper insisted on falsifiability as the mark of a scientific theory. A theory must make bold predictions that could, in principle, prove it wrong. A theory that refuses to predict or so ambiguous that it can explain any outcome, it's not practical or useful. This is the theory's first function as a predictive engine. It turns our understanding of a phenomenon into expectations about what will occur. Those predictions are valuable for both researchers who design studies and test hypotheses. It is also helpful and the practitioners who anticipate consequences of decisions. If you have a solid theory of employee motivation, you can predict how a new incentive policy may play out. The predictive power of theory is why we cannot simply let data speak for themselves. Without theory, we would not even know which data to pay attention to or how to extrapolate from past data to future events. Theory is our proactive guide. Before we move on, consider this question. What's one theory in your topic of interest that offers a clear prediction you could test? Perhaps it's a theory about effective leadership styles or a theory about how a leader behaves once they gain power. Formulate a simple if X then Y hypothesis from that theory. This exercise shows you the predictive heartbeat of a theory. The second key function of theory is serving as an anchor for data collection, analysis, and interpretation. In other words, theory guides where and how we look when studying a complex phenomenon. Without theoretical guidance, research can become an aimless expedition. With theory, our inquiries are focused and coherent. Consider that any real-world phenomenon is incredibly complex, whether it's about leadership effectiveness or organizational change. If you approach an organization with no theoretical framework, trying to study leadership in general, you will be overwhelmed by the sheer amount of observations you could make. You may collect hundreds of variables from personality traits of the leader to organizational structure to follower morale. As researchers, you'd be flying blind. Theory provides the instruments on your dashboard. It tells you what variables, which are your constructs, to zoom in on and what relationships to investigate. As we've learned in the video of what is theory, it prioritizes certain constructs as important. In practical terms, your chosen theory dictates your research design. Every empirical study in applied fields begins with a theoretical framework section, precisely to anchor the data collection. For example, in the field of leadership, which is highly interdisciplinary, it draws on psychology, sociology, and economics. Journals require authors to explicitly state the theory guiding their work. Why? Because theory organizes and justifies the methodological choices. It links the abstract ideas to concrete measures. A theory highlights the what, which factors to consider, the how those factors relate, and the why, the rationale behind those relationships. Equipped with that theoretical roadmap, you can decide where to go and what to look for. Without that theoretical roadmap, you could wander through an organization or a database indefinitely, unsure what is a signal and what is noise. Here is an example. If you want to study how a leader, let's say a CEO in a company or superintendent in a school district or a school principal in a school building, influences organizational performance, different theories of leadership will lead you to collect very different data. If you use strategic leadership theory as your theoretical lens, you will focus on variables like the leader's ability to anticipate change, articulate a vision, think strategically, and initiate change. You may measure how a leader scans the environment and how they formulate strategy documents. Now, if instead you choose servant leadership theory as your theoretical lens, you will collect entirely different data. Perhaps you measure how the leader serves employee development, the extent to which the leader practices empathy, humility, ethical stewardship of the organization. You may conduct interviews or surveys about the leader's relational and moral behaviors. Both strategic leadership and servant leadership are legitimate theoretical lenses on the same phenomenon, which is leadership. But each theory directs your attention to very different aspects of the phenomenon. What you find will depend on where you look, and where you look depends on the theoretical lens that guides you. Similarly, if you are studying moral decision-making, choosing a theoretical lens like moral foundations theory will anchor your data collection around specific moral domains. Moral foundations theory posits that people's moral judgment arises from a handful intuitive foundations, such as care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, sanctity versus degradation. If you adopt this moral foundations theory, you will likely use or develop a moral foundation questionnaire to collect data on those dimensions of morality in your participants. You won't spend much time measuring economic self-interest or political ideology directly. Those are not primary constructs in the moral foundations theory, although they may relate downstream. Instead, you'd collect data on how strongly a leader or group values loyalty or fairness, and analyze how those moral profiles relate to their decisions. By contrast, if you choose a rational choice theory, you may ignore those moral dimensions entirely and focus on cost-benefit calculations people make in organizations. Again, your theory guides your data collection. Notice that a theory also guides data analysis and interpretation. Not only what data we collect, but how we analyze and interpret data. With strategic leadership theory, a low score on articulating vision may be analyzed as a leadership weakness. But with servant leadership theory, sometimes leaders may be analyzed as strong if they score high on empowering others, regardless of vision communication. Theory provides the coding scheme for our sense-making of the data. In qualitative research, theoretical framework influences how we code interview transcripts, what we see as a relevant theme. In quantitative research, theory tells us which relationship to test. For example, I expect X to correlate with Y because the theory says so. In short, theory ensures that our empirical work is not just a random data mining exercise, but a logical investigation grounded in prior knowledge and aimed at building new knowledge. You may ask, could we just go around into the field without theory and let patterns emerge? Exploratory, data-driven research certainly has its place, but even in grounded theory, researchers carry implicit theoretical sensibilities that shape what patterns they notice. It's virtually impossible to research humans or organizations without any conceptual lens at all. Our brains will impose some theory, even if informally, to make sense of what we see. Far better to articulate a guiding theory explicitly so that your choices in research design are transparent and findings can be interpreted in the context of that framework. This is why in research articles, we require a theoretical or conceptual framework section or chapter. Some researchers treat this section as an academic formality and write a literature review, but that is a mistake. The goal of writing a chapter or a section of theoretical framework is to demonstrate that the study is anchored in and contributing back to a lineage of theoretical knowledge. A telltale sign that a study lacks a clear theoretical anchor is when its research questions are framed ambiguously around leaders or practitioners' perceptions of something. For example, what are leaders' perception of policy X? How do administrators perceive change Y? Although those kind of research questions can be useful descriptively, they often drift into very surface-level accounts unless grounded in a theory that explains why those perceptions matter, what shapes those perceptions, and how they influence organizational outcomes. I actually see this type of research questions in many first-year doctoral students' work. It often reflects a well-meaning attempt to give a voice to practitioners, but without a theoretical frame, the result is typically a descriptive summary of what people think, untethered to any explanatory mechanism or theoretical relevance. In the absence of theory, those studies risk becoming catalogs of opinions rather than analytically coherent investigations. A theoretical framework gives interpretive depth to the question. It helps you decide what perceptions to focus on, what relationships to test, and what implications your findings may have beyond the case at hand. Without that scaffolding, the research may generate interesting anecdotes, but lacks the theoretical traction to advance knowledge or inform policy or practice in meaningful ways. So here is an example of how to use a theory to guide your research. Consider how different theoretical lenses can complement each other. Leadership scholars have approached the very same organization armed with different theories and thus seen very different phenomena. One researcher goes in with transformational leadership and observes how a leader inspires team members and then collect the data on vision sharing, intellectual stimulation, and so on. Another researcher goes in with distributed leadership theory and instead observes leadership as a network of influences, and they collect the data on how team members and leaders collectively take on leadership tasks. Each theoretical lens not only guides what data are collected, but also yields very different interpretation of what is happening in that organization. There is no single correct theoretical lens, but each theory generated different pictures as to a much richer understanding. This goes back to our analogy in the previous video on what is theory. Theory is a lens. Theory is a map. They highlight some features while omitting others. We may need multiple lenses or maps, which are multiple theories, to navigate the whole terrain of a very complex phenomenon. An anchoring inquiry in theory is what allows research to be cumulative. When you publish a study, other scholars know how to build on it because you've situated it in a theoretical context they understand. If everyone just collects idiosyncratic data with no common theoretical foundations, it will be very difficult to synthesize findings or develop generalizable knowledge. Theory provides a shared language and structure that lets the field accumulate findings systematically. Over decades, leadership researchers could have a coherent conversations about transformational leadership because they share a core theory and measures, which enable meta-analysis and incremental advances. Without that theoretical anchor, those studies may have been apples and oranges. So to sum up this second function, theory organizes and focuses our inquiry. It is essential, not optional. With theory, we have a plan for what data to collect and a rationale for how to analyze our data. Without theory, empirical research becomes unguided and ungrounded. The next time you design a study, ask yourself what theory or model is guiding your choices of what to observe. If you cannot answer this question, take a step back and beef up your theoretical foundation. It will save you from collecting useless data and drifting in your data analysis. Theory as a signpost to be challenged. We've seen that theory guides predictions and research, but importantly, theory itself is not infallible. In fact, one of the most important roles of theory is to serve as a provisional signpost, waiting to be proven wrong or refined. Good theories invite scrutiny. They put themselves on the line. This is a function that keeps the science and research in general moving forward. Theory is a signpost to guide inquiry, but also a signpost that we aim to surpass. No theory is perfect, final, or sacred. Every theory, no matter how elegant or widely accepted, is an approximation of reality. Scientific theories can never be proven with absolute certainty. They can only be corroborated or falsified by testing their predictions. As a result, a theory is essentially an open invitation. Test me, challenge me, and find where I break down. The hallmark of science is that our theories are open to refutation. This means theories function as a signpost, pointing to where researchers should probe deeper. If the theory says X causes Y, then you will look for cases where maybe X does not cause Y, where something else explains better. Over time, this process weeds out weak theory or refine theories to make the theories much stronger. History of science provides a lot of examples of theories being overturned. In the mid-20th century, astronomer Fred Hoyle and colleagues championed the steady-state theory of the universe, the idea that the universe had no beginning and is continually creating matter as it expands, so it always looks roughly the same. It was a bold theory that challenged the emerging rival, the Big Bang theory, which posited a creation moment. For a while, steady state set as the prominent signpost in cosmology. Scientists test its predictions. For example, steady state predicted no large-scale evolutionary changes in the universe's appearance over time. Over the years, evidence began to poke holes in the state theory. The discovery of quasars only at great distances, and thus early times in the universe, hinted that the universe did evolve more decisively. In 1964. Penzias and Wilson discovered the cosmic microwave background radiation, a relic afterflow of a hot early universe, which the Big Bang theory had predicted and the steady state theory could not explain. Bit by bit, observations refuted steady state theory's predictions. Hoyle stubbornly held to his theory even as support waned, and by the 1970s, the Big Bang theory, once a controversial challenger, became the new paradigm. This saga illustrates that theories are superseded when a better explanation comes along. Steady-state theory served as a signpost that guided research. People looked for evidence one way or another, and ultimately that signpost was replaced by a new one when it pointed in the wrong direction. In science, we progress by identifying where our guiding theories fail, not by proving where our guiding theories are correct. The similar progress in social and organizational sciences, though perhaps in less clear-cut ways than finding cosmic radiation. Earlier, we discussed the role theory predicting behavior from organizational roles. Role theory became a common framework in the field of leadership to explain decisions of leaders and team members. However, researchers eventually noticed that reality did not always match the theory's predictions. Sometimes individuals behave out of their roles. For example, a leader may act contrary to what the leader's role script would suggest. One limitation of basic role theory is that it underestimates personal factors, knowledge, values, personalities, and motivations that can make people deviate from role expectation. A particularly important example is the construct of implicit power motivation. Here is a key: unconscious drive for power and influence, which leads them to assert themselves regardless of their official role. If someone is a high-power motivated person, they may behave dominantly and take charge even when they are not in charge. That defies role expectations. This kind of evidence challenges role theory. It says role matters, yes, but it's not the whole story. In response, researchers refine the theory, perhaps integrating trait factors with role or adding conditions to role theory. For example, role theory works unless high power motive is present, then expect deviations. The key point is the anomalies, those cases the theory could not predict. Those anomalies becomes the seeds for new theory. Instead of dismissing or discarding the anomalies, scholars could embrace themselves to improve understanding. In educational leadership, trust between teachers, principals, and stakeholders is known to be very important. Early work on trust in schools theorized trust as a rational calculation based on 5 facets: benevolence, reliability, competence, honesty, and openness. The 5 phases of trust guided many studies. It was a useful signpost for measuring and developing trust. However, later research began to uncover cracks in this purely rational model. Scholars found who is trusted often depends on social group membership. Leaders tend to extend trust preferentially to those in their in-group, the people who share the same characteristics, rather than purely on merit. Moreover, power differences distort trust in social exchanges. Specifically, high-power individuals tend to trust others less because they have less incentive to risk vulnerability, whereas low-power people are often surprisingly trusting toward the powerful, perhaps due to optimism or lack of options. Those research findings do not neatly fit the 5 phases of rational theory of trust. They suggest trust is influenced by bias and context, not just the moral qualities of individuals. In response, researchers propose new theoretical extensions, for example, an irrational or motivated attribution model of trust that accounts for those biases. Here, again, the initial theory served as a signpost. It framed what trust should look like. When reality showed systematic deviation due to, for example, identity and power and group membership, those deviations illuminated where the theory was incomplete. The result is that we gain a better understanding of how power works in organizations. A theory thrives not by being untouched by criticism, but by withstanding theoretical tests, or being replaced by a better theory that explains more. For researchers and practitioners, the lesson is that treat every theory as provisional. Respect established theories that often earned their place by explaining a lot, but never revere them as untouchable dogma. Theories are made to be tested, to be stretched, or even broken. When you review literature in your field, ask, what assumptions does this theory make? In what situations those assumptions fail? Adopting this mindset will make you a more active and critical thinker. Maybe your research will find a popular model that does not quite work in your unique context. That is an important contribution. As long as you approach it rigorously, challenging a theory, even a big-name theory, is a way to advance knowledge. As the saying goes, theories are nets, cast to catch what we call the world, to rationalize, to explain, and to master it. We endeavor to make the mesh ever finer and finer. This metaphor of nets reminds us that theories are tools designed to help us capture and make sense of reality. When a theory fails to explain what we observe, we refine it or replace it with a better one. Scientific progress depends not on avoiding error, but on detecting and correcting it through ever more precise theoretical frameworks. All theories are simplifications. We hang on to a theory as long as it fits the observations better than alternatives, but we must be ready to let it go when something better comes along. Science and research require this humility and openness to change. Think of a theory or model you've encountered in the literature you suspect may have some blind spots. It could be a classical management principle or leadership style, or a theory on organizational behavior. Why do you think it may not tell the whole story? How would you test its limits? Identify those questions, and you essentially chart how you could contribute to refining or refuting that theory, which is exactly the work of advanced scholarship. Embracing theory as a provisional signpost also means cultivating a culture of critical dialogue and principled debate. Scholars should feel empowered, even obligated, to question and test the assumptions of even the most established theories in the field, provided we do so through evidence, logic, and scholarly rigor, rather than resorting to personal attacks or dismissing individuals instead of engaging their ideas. When a field refuses to interrogate its foundational theories, treating them as untouchable dogma rather than testable frameworks, it risks intellectual stagnation. Theories must remain open to refinement, rejection, or replacement as new empirical findings emerge. A thriving, scholarly community welcomes dissent not as a disruption, but as a necessary condition for theoretical advancement. Recent adversarial collaboration in research on consciousness provide a compelling model for this ethos. For example, a multi-lab consortium including proponents of global neuronal workplace theory and integrated information theory adopt rigorous research protocols to pit their competing predictions against each other. The results published in Nature in April 2025 decisively challenged the core claims of both theories, finding limited support for global neuronal workplace theory in prefrontal cortex and integrated information theory's signature posterior synchronization. These collaborations exemplify how rigorous collaborative critique, not mere commentary, drives science forward. If you propose a new theory, you should welcome others to critique it. That's how you will find its weakness and improve your theory. A healthy field is one where theories are constantly under friendly fire, evolving through trial by fire. Educational administration, for example, saw rigorous debates between traditional functionalist theory and the critical theorists like Thomas Greenfield in the 1970s and 80s. Greenfield urged the field to recognize the value-laden nature of its theories, which directly challenged the dominant rational models. This clash forced the researchers to clarify assumptions and ultimately lead to more pluralistic approaches that acknowledge both objective and subjective perspectives. Theory evolves through challenges. Every time you read a journal article where the author suggests an extension to theory or a revised model, you are witnessing this function of theory being a signpost that is always up for revision and replacement. By treating theory as provisionals, we ensure that our knowledge does not stagnate. In your research, don't just ask, how can I apply this theory? But also ask, how might my findings inform and change this theory? Theories gain legacy when researchers, including new researchers like you, test them in new arenas, either confirm their robustness or push them to evolve. This is how you can contribute to theoretical development, not by using theory, but by questioning theory. The fourth function of theory is theory functions as a framework to synthesize and connect fragmented findings, especially in applied fields. Researchers often accumulate numerous isolated findings about a phenomenon, bits and pieces that, without integration, feel like disjointed puzzle pieces. A well-crafted theory can gather those pieces and form a coherent picture. An example is the development of job demands resources theory. Prior to its emergence, studies on workplace stress, motivation, burnout, and engagement often existed in separate silos. Researchers documented dozens of variables: emotional exhaustion, workload, autonomy, feedback, social support, but those findings lacked common explanatory framework. The job demands resources theory brought order to this conceptual chaos. It proposes that all job characteristics could be broadly classified as either demands, which drain your energy and increase burnout risk, or resources, which support motivation and performance. This elegant structure unified previously disconnected findings and allowed scholars to build cumulative knowledge across occupations and national contexts. Moreover, it helped practitioners design interventions with a clearer understanding of which levers to pull. Do we reduce demands, increase resources, or both? Job demands and resources theory did not just add to the literature, it integrated the findings. It demonstrated how a strong theoretical framework can connect the dots that once seemed scattered. Likewise, in sociology, social capital theory integrated observations from sociology and economics about the value of networks and relationships. Researchers have long observed the phenomenon like the strength of weak ties in job searching and the role of community networks in facilitating cooperation. Social capital theory provided a theoretical construct that tied those observations together. It argued that networks of relationships constitute a variable resource, which is the capital, that can facilitate action. By naming and theorizing this concept, previously isolated findings from education, crime, and economic development could be seen as instances of a common underlying principle that social connections have value that impacts different outcomes. Here, social capital theory did not necessarily predict anything radically new. Its contribution was to integrate and illuminate a pattern across different contexts. In leadership studies, we can find integration examples as well. Transformational leadership theory came at a time when research on leadership was divided among trait approaches, behavioral styles, and the transactional reward and punishment approaches. The transformational leadership theory synthesized the elements of charisma, vision, and individualized consideration. It linked them to follower motivation and organizational change. It created a unified model that integrated prior work on charismatic leadership or leader-member exchange and on the insufficiency of purely transactional leadership. Over the next decades, this transformational leadership theory guided a large volume of research and practically oriented writing, largely because it resonated and provided a structure to integrate practical leadership experiences people observed, such as leaders inspiring change beyond just carrot and stick management. Another interesting integrative theory in organizational science is institutional theory in sociology of organizations. By the 1970s, scholars had many case studies of organizations adopting similar structure or practices for reasons not obviously tied to organizational efficiency. Institutional theory integrated those cases by theorizing that organizations are influenced by cultural norms, rules, and myths in their environment, which lead to homogenization, which is isomorphism, as they seek legitimacy. This theoretical lens tied together very different findings about things like formal organizational structure, hiring practices, even school rituals under a common explanation. Organizations conform to institutionalized expectations. What was once a loose collection of anecdotes became an established body of knowledge through the integrative power of the theory. Why is integration important? Because knowledge advances not just by digging deeper into specifics, but also by seeing the bigger picture. Practitioners often struggle when research offers 100 disconnected findings. A robust integrative theory can simplify and bring order. Self-determination theory in psychology integrated decades of motivation research by proposing that much can be understood via three basic human needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. This helped explain diverse findings in education work and health contexts under one theoretical framework, which is far more actionable than a laundry list of 50 motivators. As a researcher in training, you may sometimes feel overwhelmed by many studies you read. Part of your task in the literature review is integrative, to identify themes, patterns, or frameworks that weave those studies into a coherent theoretical narrative. A literature review is not a laundry list of findings. For example, study A find this, study B find that. This is very common in poorly written literature reviews. It shows you have not given much thought about why those findings matter, how they relate to one another, and what story they collectively tell. This is why we always ask students to create your own voice, your own narratives in literature review. This narrative explains why those findings matter, how they relate to one another, or what theory they collectively tell. A laundry list literature review leaves readers with scattered findings, but no coherent narrative that explains the phenomenon. Instead, your goal in writing a literature review is to synthesize, to show how different pieces relate, to illustrate the gaps, the tension, and the trajectory in the field or in a topic. If the literature lacks an integrative theory, that could even be an area where you contribute by proposing a model or theoretical framework that links together previously isolated factors. One way to make a theoretical contribution is by organizing elements of prior work in a novel way. In other words, theory building is not only about inventing brand new constructs or relationships, it's about stepping back, seeing existing pieces, which are research findings reported in the literature review. Look at those research findings from a higher vantage point and connect the dots into something more coherent and powerful. To leverage this function, when reviewing research findings, you constantly ask, how do the findings relate? Is there an underlying principle or mechanism? Also pay attention to conceptual or theoretical framework offered by authors. Very often, an article will include a figure or a model summarizing how they think different factors connect. Those are integrative mini-theories. Collect and compare those models. If you find yourself saying, research in these areas is all over the place, that's a call for theoretical integration. Possibly, you will find that an established theory from another field can serve as an integrative framework for your topic. Importing a theory can be a way to integrate too. For example, using social identity theory from psychology to integrate findings about organizational behavior of teams. Theory serves as a glue that holds together different pieces of empirical evidence. It helps us see the forest from the trees. As you grow as a scholar and researcher, think of theory as a scaffold that can be erected to support a growing structure of findings. And sometimes you may be the one to design a new scaffold to bring coherence to a messy area of research. In this video, we talk about the 4 functions of theory. By now, a very important message should resonate. Theory is not optional in research. It is the foundation upon which meaningful, credible, and impactful research is built. Theory organizes our inquiries, enlightens our understanding, even stirs our conscience. It's both a tool and a target for investigating the world and a target for improvement and refinement.